Okay, good evening, all. It is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar, Prophetic and the Flag. My name is Dr. Elisa Louis, and I'm your chair for this evening. This webinar is being hosted by the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum and the University of East London, and aims to explore what is described as Christian nationalism and its impact on religion, politics, and culture in Britain and Ireland. This webinar will take place today, and it's St. George's Day in England, an occasion associated with patriotism, pride, and identity. This webinar follows on from previous successful RJAF and UEL conference, Race, Religion, Rhetoric, and Far-Right Extremism, a Response, which took place in February 2025. The day-long event explored the riots of 2024, which shook the nations to the core, creating a sense of fear, anger, despair, and confusion among those who were impacted by the acts of violence and hostile, intolerant attitudes. The same feelings people across the country are experiencing today. The RJAF is cognizant that long before Donald Trump's forceful promotion of Christian nationalism in the USA, the situation on these shores had already been shifting from a culture of tolerance to one of intolerance, both religiously and racially. Christian nationalism has weaponized that transition, globalizing it and rebranded it as white supremacy. And while the RJAF cannot say it is surprised by the inexorable rise of far-right extremism and Christian nationalism seen in the United Kingdom March and Unite the Kingdom Christmas Carol service, but along with many others, were deeply disturbed by its speed and intensity. As we are all aware, issues around culture and identity, a sense of what it means to belong and to be British, are an unfortunate zeitgeist matter. The RJAF is aware that some Christian denominations and parachurch organizations have rightly condemned far-right and extremist movements in Britain and Ireland. However, it remains unclear why so many churches were slow and are slow to challenge the insidious rhetoric of protecting the rights of so-called natives over non-natives, all in the name of preserving an exclusive cultural identity. There's little doubt that Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, even 2 millennia later, still speaks powerfully to the relationship between so-called natives and foreigners. As many folks have pointed out, next month sees the local elections, at which far-right parties are expected to make political gains, and the next Tommy Robinson event in London. Equally, the FIFA Football World Cup, which starts in June of this year, is always a catalyst for English-related flag-waving, patriotism, nationalism, from a gender perspective, sees an unfortunate massive spike in domestic violence against women. This webinar is very much the RJAF and UEL's contribution to this conversation. Both organizations are acutely aware that for many Black and Brown Britons of faith, this matter is not a theoretical one, but one which calls into question their very right to exist or to be in Britain and Ireland. So tonight's contributors, again, myself, I'm Dr. Elisa Louis, theologian, academic, and writer. We also have Bishop Mike Royal, who's the General Secretary for Churches Together in England. We have the Reverend Dr. Israel Olofinjana, Director of the One People's Commission for the Evangelical Alliance. We have Dr. Nadia Habashi, Cluster Lead in Criminology, Justice and Policing, a Senior Lecturer at the University of East London. We have the Reverend Dr. Al Barrett, Rector at Hodge Hill Church and Oversight Minister, Theologian and Writer. We also have Reverend Dr. Tessa Henry Robinson, moderator of the Free Churches Group, England and Wales Free Churches, president of Churches Together England, and past moderator of the General Assembly of the United Reformed Church and minister of the Word and Sacraments. And last but not least, we have Reverend Dr. Indigit Bogle, OBE, head of Church of Sanctuary and retired Methodist minister. He was a former president of the Methodist Conference and founder of the City of Sanctuary movement. And so as we listen to each of the presentations tonight, please do make sure to drop your questions in the Q&A function. I'll do my best to get through them, but please manage your expectations. There are going to be many of us here tonight, and we may not get through them all. Please keep your comments and questions respectful. This conversation can be heavy. There are a lot of people's feelings, emotions, and livelihoods and lives at stake, their experiences as well. So please make this a safe space where you can enact your free speech, but with respect, with consideration, and with maturity. And so now it's time to hand over to our first speaker, Reverend Dr. Israel Olufinjana. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Elisa, and good evening, everyone. Such a privilege and pleasure to be here this evening to be able to speak into this topic in that sense, looking at St. George's Day. I want to offer three reflections in this 10 minutes. One is a reflection around our understanding of Christian nationalism and perhaps the need to nuance some of the conversation. And I want to do that because I think it's important to diagnose the problem well so that when we begin to prefer and suggest solution, it kind of flows in the right direction. And then the second thing I want to do is consider migration. And I want to come to that by looking at theologies of migration, which I think it's important for the church to wrestle with in the UK. And then lastly, I want to look at intercultural Christianity as a kind of a bridge and as a kind of a hope to look forward to in this conversation. So let me start with the first reflection around our understanding on Christian nationalism. I think that is the term that is popular at the moment that we use in the UK and United States and other places to describe what we are seeing at the moment. Myself and few other people on this call and other places, there is a reluctance that that term might not capture very well everything that is going on. So I think there is the need to, I suppose, understand some of the primers, some of the drives that is causing what we are seeing at the moment. There is questions around identity, particularly homogeneous identity, national homogeneous identity. There are questions around citizenship, who is British, who is not British, and you can narrow that down precisely to who is English, who is Irish, who is Scottish, who is Welsh. You could zoom it down into those sort of questions. There's also questions around migration. Is migration good for the British people, or is it bad news for the British people? Within those questions, my observation is that there are four primers that are driving uh, issues around Christian nationalism or nationalistic Christianity, is another way of looking at it in that sense. I think one is around nostalgia. The second is around culture. A third is around fear. And then a fourth is around renewal. What do I mean by these four things? I think there are more, but because of time, I just want to narrow to these four. Nostalgia, because I think people are in search of something at the moment. That search has been going on. There's been various crises, what you could describe as polycrisis, that has led to various shifts in society that has caused people to a place where they're asking questions and they are searching for meaning, searching for roots, and searching for relevance. And in terms of that search, people are looking for a kind of a cohesive factor, something around community, except that in this particular scenario, people are looking for a homogeneous national identity or culture. And so that nostalgia has drive people to look back. What makes us English, if I may use that as an example? Is it a pop culture? Is it queuing? Is it the rule of law? Is it democracy? Is it tolerance? What is it that makes us English? Because we're talking about St. George's, patron saint of England today. So it's important to zoom in into Englishness in that sense. And I think when you look at all these other social elements, you begin to see that actually one of the cohesive factors around Englishness is Christianity. Now, of course, the challenge is when you begin to look at it, you begin to come to a kind of sense of Christ and country, which reflects a kind of a Christendom model of Christianity, which is, it's not just Christianity and discipling and opening to other nations. It is Christ and country. And so it's a very specific expression of Christianity. And so the nostalgia leads into a culture, a kind of a cultural Christianity. And within that cultural Christianity framework is trying to think of, okay, uh, Christianity is our culture. And so who else is not Christian here that needs to go? Or who else is not part of who we are that needs to be demonized in that sense? And so cultural Christianity is deployed as a tool to address fear, which is the third thing that I was talking about, fear. There's politics of fear at the moment, but there's also a visceral fear around Islam and migration and other people for various reasons. And so because of that, this kind of drivers, they become very interesting. But the last one is renewal. And I think this one, we're seeing this manifested itself in terms of people being fed up of the established church for various reasons, which I don't have time to nuance and to go into. But because of the being fed up with the established church in this sense, there is again a search for a kind of a conservative cultural Christianity to replace that or to champion that in a different way. And so this drivers is leading us to a kind of a, what I would describe as a neo Christendom. We're seeing Christendom coming back, whether it's the flags or whether it's the chants or whether it's the songs, whatever it is, it's there. And so what we call Christian nationalism could be labeled neo Christendom, could be labeled far right Christianity, could be labeled nationalistic Christianity, and other terms that other people have proposed. So that's the first thing. But then the second stage is migration and the need for the church to begin to speak out more on migration. Because I think the problem, as I see it, is that people in our churches are buying into the politics of migration. And the politics of migration is simply saying that we need to manage multiculturalism. We need to control migration as it is. Of course, I am not here advocating for an open borders. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is for us as Christian, people of the book, people who believe scripture, what does the Bible actually have to say about migration? I think that's an important question for every Christian need to ask today. And so, because what people sometimes people have imbibed in our churches is this politics of migration, which sort of talks about this control and everything, which I get it. But what about theologies of migration? The fact that the Bible talks a lot from Genesis to Revelation, there's a place in scripture that talks about when the children of Israel were rehearsing their story, my father was a wandering Aramean, who came to this part. That was mentioned in Deuteronomy, or that the fact that God called Abraham from the Ur of the Chaldeans into a promised land, or the fact that Joseph was forced and experienced forced migration to Egypt, or the fact that Ruth and Naomi, they experience another version of migration, and Jesus himself, had to be displaced, as some would say, or some would say refugee in Egypt in that sense. In fact, Paul went as far as saying that as us as Christians, we are aliens because earth is not is our temporary resident. Our heavenly citizenship is in heaven. And so as a result of that, all Christians are migrants by implication and theologically. And so this needs to be enacted and to be taught in our churches, this theology of or theologies of migration. Today we talked, in other parts of the world and even in the West, we talked about diaspora mission. We talked about reverse mission. These are areas of mission that I've talked about actually the scattering of people and the scattering of God's people has been actually a blessing to global mission to the West in that sense. I myself, my own story is situated within that. I came as a reverse missionary from Nigeria to the UK 22 years ago in that sense. And there are other people like me. And so this idea that migrants have come to benefit from the system, you could flip it in another way to say, actually, some migrants, they haven't come to benefit from the system, but they have come to give benefits. They've come to contribute in that sense. And so that becomes a powerful narrative in that sense. So that's something just to offer. And then the last thought for conclusion, so that I can let my other panelists speak, is something around intercultural Christianity. Uh, and I think here it is again. I think Christianity from its very beginning is intercultural. There is something called world Christianity, which talks about global Christianity. Christianity can never be monopolized by one culture. The way it was set up from its very beginning, from the day of Pentecost, it was no accident that the day that God chose to give birth to his church was a day that there were different people congregating at a Jewish festival in Israel, in that particular time. And so the genesis of the church and the history of the church reflects world Christianity. You move to the beginning of the first 300 years of the church. The language that was spoken by the church was Coptic, was Latin, was Greek, was Aramaic. This is to reflect the global nature and the interculturality of the church. And so, even where we are today, we talked about the majority world Christians growing in that sense. So, Christianity is intercultural. And so, for me, how can we then begin to apply that in an individual congregation around our discipleship? How can we begin to bring people together to create almost a kind of a new multiculturalism in our churches in that sense? And I've been one of the people talking about the need to develop intercultural ecclesiologies, that is, intercultural radical communities where we have different people, white British refugees, all doing life together. And I think we have a lot of intercultural churches in the UK today, which I think they are counter and very counterintuitive to what we see at the moment and very prophetic. And I think I want to submit that as a hope that I have as a person, because this conversation has impacted me mentally and in other ways, either because of neighbors putting up flags and so on and so forth. But I live in hope when I see intercultural congregations modeling something of God's kingdom. I'm going to leave it there so that other people can talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Israel Olafinjana. Please do put your questions in the Q&A function so that we can come back to them at the end. Moving on next to Dr. Nadia Habashi. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't know how I can um, um, come after as eloquently as my fourth speaker, Dr. Israel. I found that incredibly enlightening, and also the issue that you said about managing multiculturalism. I'd like to pick that up with you later on. So I'm really grateful for coming to being part of this very important discussion today, because it's an incredibly timely one. But what I want to look at is in terms of being more about exploring the issues of faith, responsibility, but also significantly for me, what it actually means to be prophetic in very difficult, stricken times. Because for me, the question at the heart of this discussion around the prophetic and the flag is ultimately a question about truth and belonging. So if we look at this then, who speaks truth in moments of tension, and who gets to belong under the symbols that define this nation, the nation? Because I'm seeing now very acutely, given my background, my religion, etc., is that we are living, or people like me and others are living through a moment where the language of division has become incredibly normalized. So we have these words of invasion, culture, identity, and they are no longer neutral. And what they're doing, they are shaping how we understand who belongs and who does not. And for me, that's why the prophetic tradition becomes really necessary, because the prophetic voice has never simply reflected the dominant mood of society. It's always challenged it. It's always spoken into moments where injustice is being normalized and where silence becomes easier than truth. But now I feel very much that we're actually in an age of hypocrisy. And I feel that that's become the operating system of racism, because it's not always loud or explicit. Now we have it sometimes a bit more subtle, coded, but more worryingly, increasingly accepted. And I want to structure that within what's playing out literally now. In a few weeks' time, we will have that 16th of May march, the so-called Unite the Kingdom march. And it's really important that we look at what this actually represents, because this is not simply about patriotism or national pride. It is about the clear drawing of boundaries. It is about defining who is inside this nation and who is out of it. And in this moment, people like me, Muslims, are very much clearly positioned as outside of it. And so we have seen in the last few days and weeks, especially the last few days, language associated with this movement, which portrays Muslims as dangerous, criminal, taking over the country. And that language is not accidental. It is very deliberate. And it's also aimed at constructing what I would class as a threat. And this is where the prophetic voice actually matters, because the prophetic voice does not accept narratives that dehumanize, and it does not allow fear to define who is worthy of belonging. And instead, it asks, for me, very difficult questions. It asks, what kind of society are we becoming when we allow entire communities to be spoken about in this way? And what kind of silence allows that to continue? And we can see it very much, see the nature of this very clearly, the rhetoric of this very clearly. I am going to use some language that's been put out there in media, which might offend people. So if you're offended, I just want to reflect what is going on within that narrative now. So on the 16th of March, there was the invitation of the far-right firebrand person, Valentina Gomez from America. She was thankfully denied entry into the UK, but only after significant objection, because she was originally given the visa to come to the UK. And now her response to the rejection of her visa by the Home Secretary was not one of reflection, it was one of escalation. And forgive me for uttering these words, but she then referred to the Home Secretary as a dirty Pakistani Muslim. Okay, and if we look even more closely at the kind of language that's being used, we say that this language, for me, is not only directed at Muslims as a group, but specifically at Muslim women, because her whole narrative and what she's been doing has been about seeking rhetoric which mocks the hijab, that frames Muslim women through stereotypes of control and subjugation, and then reduces entire communities to criminal caricatures. For me, that's actually quite significant, because what's happening here, it's not just the racism, it's the intersection of racism and misogyny, and it's the targeting of identity at multiple levels at once. You've got faith, gender, and ethnicity. And that kind of language does something quite dangerous for me, and I hope to others, because what it does, it strips people of dignity. It reduces them to symbols, and it then creates this climate in which inclusion becomes to feel justified. And this really matters, because it's not simply an insult. What it does is it collapses race, religion, and nationality into a single point of attack, and it marks Muslim identity as something to be degraded. And it sends a message that authority itself is illegitimate when held by someone who is Muslim. And that is the language of exclusion. However, in her diatribe, she actually went further. And this is important to convey. In her response to being banned, she actually put out that she's not just coming with Jesus Christ. She's coming with current and former soldiers of the US military. If they really want to deny my entry, well, they're just going to have to stop the boats. And for me, you see within that language something even more revealing, that faith itself is being invoked not as a source of a compassion or justice or humility, but as a justification for power and confrontation. And I find that a real distortion of what the prophetic truly is, because the prophetic voice does not align itself with power in that way. It does not weaponize faith. It does not use religion to exclude. It does the opposite. It stands with the people who are marginalized, and it challenges the misuse of power. But also, ultimately, it refuses to allow faith to be used as a tool of division. And that brings us to the flag. Because in moments like this, the flag becomes more than a symbol, it becomes a question. Who does it represent? Who is seen as belonging under it? And who feels that it is no longer theirs? For some people, the flag represents pride and identity, but for others, it's become associated with exclusion, with moments where they have made to feel that their presence is conditional or contested. And if a national symbol cannot be experienced equally by all of those who live within that nation, then it's no longer functioning as a symbol of unity. It becomes a boundary, not of geography, but of belonging. And it becomes a marker of inclusion for some and exclusion for others. So I feel it's important to say that this is not just about the far right. What we are witnessing is a broader shift in the tone of public discourse. Language across political spaces is becoming more abrasive, more polarized, and actually increasingly permissive of hostility. There was a recent, quite actually, I was surprised, comments, really not acceptable comments from the Home Secretary a few days ago about a person who challenged her about migration. And it was actually quite shocking to hear a Secretary of State utilizing language like that. And that for me is problematic because when it happens, it creates an environment in which more extreme narratives can take root and grow because language sets the limits of what's acceptable, and it also shapes what can be said and what can be challenged and what is allowed to pass without question. Hence my, raised eyebrows very much so in terms of what the Home Secretary said yesterday. But when those limits begin to shift, the consequences then are not abstract, they're actually felt. And they're felt by those who are being spoken about. They're felt in the quiet calculations that people make when they are safe, where they are welcome, and where they are not. And for me, this is why the prophetic voice is very necessary in this moment, because that prophetic voice does not wait for consensus or permission. It has to speak when something is wrong, and it has to name what is happening. And it also should, very much so, refuse to allow the boundaries of belonging to be narrowed without challenge. So for me, as a Muslim woman, as an academic, is that the question for the church is not whether it has a role to play, it is whether it is willing to be prophetic, whether it's willing to speak clearly when language is being used to exclude, degrade, and divide, or whether it will remain cautious and in doing so allow those boundaries to become to continue to shift. This time is not a time for silence. This moment is not a neutral moment. Positions must be taken, and because that position has consequences, I think that one of the main things for me is about hope, and hope in that prophetic sense, which should not be something which is passive. It should not just be about optimism. For me, hope should be about action, those decisions to speak, even when it is an uncomfortable environment to do so, and also to challenge, even when it is very inconvenient to challenge, but also to insist that belonging should not be conditional, because at its core, that prophetic voice isn't just about critique, it's about what is possible, about holding open the vision of a society which is grounded in justice, dignity, and true belonging. And I feel that this is what is being asked of us at this particular moment in time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much for the challenging presentation, Dr. Nadia Habashi. We're going to move on. For time's sake, we're going to hear now from Bishop Mike Royal. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to pay tribute to the previous two colleagues who have spoken. Firstly, I want to say a happy St. George's Day to all who are celebrating that today. I also want to start with a scriptural reading, the words of Jesus, Matthew 7, and verse 15, watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. I want to focus my thoughts particularly on St. George's Day, on the flag. What's in a flag? Well, I think there's nothing intrinsically wrong with a flag. The question is how they are used and what is motivating those who are using them. I was reading an article this week in Church Times that argued that patriotism, or a healthy patriotism, has three marks. Firstly, it's about honesty. And when we think about our nation and we think about our flag, the St. George's flag, then in that there is a history that is good, there is a history that is bad, and there is a history that is ugly. And the flag has to, in honesty, embrace all of that. Secondly, there should be a particularity without exclusion. It is possible to be really proud of one's own nation, but actually to also healthily embrace those from other backgrounds and from other nations too. And that has to be something that as Christians we are encouraging. The flag should never be used, as we've heard earlier, to exclude, but rather as an inclusive symbol for all to gather around. And thirdly, there should always be an orientation towards the common good. And I think there's a real opportunity to use patriotic moments to bring people together and not to divide them. I saw this morning on social media a person of South Asian descent waving the flag and saying, come and join us. We're having bingo, we're having food, we're having games, we're having fun. And it was just wonderful. But what he finished in what he was saying, what he said was, this flag belongs to all of us. And I really liked that because there was a real desire to redeem the flag. So how has the English flag, our English flag, been co-opted by far-right groups? Well, certainly the Union flag was co-opted in the 1970s and 80s by the National Front. The St. George's flag is currently being co-opted by the Raise the Colours and put up at roundabouts and along main roads across England. And we know that this has been politically backed by parties. We know that this has been politically backed by parties like Reform and Restore. And the latter, Restore, are wanting mass deportation of UK citizens who are non-white. This is completely unacceptable. And the leader of Restore, Rupert Lowe, is backed by Elon Musk. Say no more. It's been co-opted by Britain First, an organisation who once again espouse mass deportation of British citizens who are not white. And we saw this recently in Manchester. And the putting up of flags has meant that sometimes health workers from global majority heritage backgrounds have felt intimidated to go about their daily duties and to do their health visits, where flags are being flown in particular neighbourhoods, as with the aim of othering people. And so what should be the church's response in terms of the use of the flag? I have no problems with churches flying the St. George's flag, particularly on St. George's days. And I hope that in the flying of the flag on a day like this, that it can help to redeem the flag, because intrinsically churches should be and are welcoming places. The flying of the flag in our churches of different nations is also something that I grew up with as a Christian. I grew up with in a diverse church where we would have days where we celebrated different cultures. We'd have Ghana Day, we'd have Nigeria Day, we'd have Zimbabwe Day, and it was a wonderful opportunity to celebrate the diversity of the congregation. And those flags were flown alongside the British flag, and it was an absolutely beautiful experience. I would encourage these intercultural moments in our churches as we move forward, as a way to deepen our understanding of different cultures and to also be enriched. And then, of course, I think churches should get behind special patriotic days like the Jubilee celebrations, where the flag can be flown, but it can be to bring people together. On a personal level, I want to reflect on 3 moments where I have felt proud of the flag. Queen's Silver Jubilee, 1977. I remember the trestle tables and the jelly and ice cream that was served kind of in my road, in my neighbourhood. And, you know, I was only 8 years old, but I remember it well, and it was a positive experience. Euros in 1996, watching the footy with neighbours and friends, including a group of, as we were then, young ministers who were from across the globe. And particularly, the England-Germany match, and a friend of mine who was German, and I was cheering for England. It was just a beautiful moment. And then, of course, the 2012 Olympics, where Britain was such great hosts, but so many nations were also celebrated alongside British success. At Churches Together in England, our 6 presidents representing our churches have made several statements in this current malaise. They made a statement in 2024 around the riots, and where we saw hotels being set on fire with people in them. They made a statement around the Unite the Kingdom rally and the use of Christian symbols at that rally being something that should not be accepted. They made statements around the Manchester synagogue terror attack and the Peacehaven mosque arson attack. And I want to say that our churches will continue to make those statements. I want to finish with this. I saw something that happened in the last couple of weeks in Wolverhampton, where there was a protest by far-right extremists, and they had their flags draped around them, but they were 2 black women who had their church flags, and they were dancing and they were worshipping and they were waving their flags, and literally it changed the atmosphere. It was the coming together of the truth of genuine faith and the error of nationalism. God help the church to stand in this moment, to redeem the flag for all, and to stand against racism, to stand against extremism, and to stand against voices that would divide us. Thank you for listening.
Amen. Thank you so much, Bishop Mike Royal. Please do drop your questions into the question and answer function so that we can get to them. We're going to move on to the Reverend Dr. Al Barrett. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elisa. Let me begin by introducing my context locally. I'm a Church of England vicar in East Birmingham in a place called Hodge Hill, just on the edge of the Birmingham conurbation. And I'm vicar of a parish of about 20,000 people on the edge of the city that includes One large council estate that was historically white working class and is now much more ethnically mixed, and a large bit of suburbia in the middle of the parish, which these days is about 95% Muslim. Mostly of Pakistani heritage. So, in some ways, my parish is a microcosm of some of the issues that we're grappling with tonight. These people are my neighbours. And in the middle of my parish is a triangle of green, Hodge Hill Common, a historic bit of common land, a place for encountering each other, a place for doing business together, a place for making friends across our differences. That's a bit of my local context. Here's a bit of global context. We're in a world that is falling apart. Collapse is all around us in all kinds of ways. But we need to be honest that that collapse is felt and experienced differently. Collapse is unevenly distributed in its impact. Depending on who we are, our identity and where we're located, that collapse can feel quite different. But collapse in global ways also has local effects. This is not a pothole on my local road, but it could easily be so. A symbol, perhaps, of where our bodies come to collision with the things that are falling apart around us at the moment in ways that we feel in our bodies, in our spirits. And I want to enter into this conversation with the question that Nigerian Yoruba thinker Bayo Akomolafe asks: what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis itself? What if our habitual ways of responding actually are often stuck in some of the modes that are causing things to fall apart in the first place? Some of those modes we might recognize from the psychology of trauma and human responses to it. Flight, we can run away. Fight, we can get our fists ready to battle. Freeze, we can be stuck like a rabbit in the headlights and not move and not know what to do. Paralysis. There's the fawn response, which identifies the powerful authority figures and kind of sucks up to them in the hope that we'll be okay if we do. And there's force, which in these senses is about trying to control the environment around us and imagining that, if only we can control the conditions, then everything's going to be okay. And of course, that is a bit of an illusion. Other F words are also available, but I won't go into them now. An invitation from Bayo Akomolafe then, and I just need to move. Yeah. When things get hard, rigid, imperviously solid, cracks, he says, are the first responders. Cracks are not simply ruptures to be feared or repaired. They're the sacred stutters in the script of certainty. New kinds of relations, dwellings, and gestures are needed. They will happen with cracks. So I want to begin with a wondering. Where are the cracks and what might it mean to dwell in them? And another invitation from Sikh activist in the United States, Valerie Kaur. She invites us to wonder as the place where love begins and reminds us that when we stop wondering about other people, then all kinds of horrible violence can then become possible. When we start imagining that the person in front of us we know through and through, we can pin down, then love ends and violence begins. So an invitation to wonder. And here's a local story. I got back from holiday last summer to a text saying, have you seen this? There was going to be a protest outside the hotel just down the road, which houses asylum seekers just on the edge of our parish. And my colleagues knew what to do. So about half a dozen of us turned up on the day, and we met a small but growing crowd of people wrapped in flags, and we met them with cupcakes and flowers. It's amazing how a macho white bloke can be threatened by a less macho white bloke vicar offering them a rose. And then we listened. We listened to what they had to say. We weren't there for an argument. We wanted to listen. And what we heard underneath the anger were stories of insecurity, stories of fear and anxiety, stories like, my husband's just lost his job. I don't know what we're going to do. Stories like, my daughter's just been made homeless. Stories like, I don't feel safe walking through the local park anymore because there aren't any police around. And if we stay at that moment before jumping to what they did next, which was to point at the hotel and say it's their fault, if we stay in that moment, then I think wondering, being curious about what's there, might take us in a different direction. And here's where I want to come to the flags. I've got 4 P's for you. The first is powers. Flags are not just spontaneously popped up by local people. There's big money and big power behind them. There are forces driving this that actually want to provoke culture wars moments. They want viral images that can be shared around the world of people putting them up, people taking them down, fights between one and the other. But they do have resonances closer to home, and I speak for some of my neighbours and what I've heard from them in this. And one is about pride. We've named it tonight. A sense of national pride attached to the flag, but who is the us? Who is included in that story, and how truthful is it? Paul Gilroy, the post-colonial theorist, describes what he calls post-imperial melancholia. The empire has ended, but we've not done the grieving that we need to do. And we've not had that honest conversation about what's been bad about the empire, as well as what might have been good. We need to do that grieving. And so thirdly, pain. The flags, I think, symbolize pain in some ways. They symbolize the precarity and the insecurity of many that want to put them up as a kind of 2 fingers up to the establishment, because actually that personal insecurity needs to go somewhere. And that personal insecurity has been amplified by narratives that scarce resources mean that someone's got to win and someone's got to lose. And underneath that, as Israel mentioned earlier, that sense of disorientation in a changing world. And I think some of that is about place. Flags are, on one level, a bit like a dog pissing up a lamppost. They're marking territory. They're saying, this is ours, not yours. And that's a very racialized way of marking territory. But I think underneath that is maybe a longing for place and a sense of a loss of place. Place to be proud in, place to be connected to, place that feels like it's shared. And isn't it interesting that a lot of those kind of losses, well, maybe they are intergenerational long-term losses for many in our communities that might be labelled so-called native, but also they're very similar losses that those who are seeking asylum in this country are wrestling with as well. Isn't that a strange, mysterious kind of common ground, if only we can discover it? And I want to just end with an invitation that comes from the United States, from Resmaa Menakem, the psychiatrist, who starts with the well-documented idea of intergenerational trauma amongst Black people in the United States, from displacement and enslavement and the ongoing oppression of Black bodies. But Menakem also says, what if the white settlers in the United States brought with them trauma from the violence of medieval Europe, from 500 years or so of ordinary people being subjected to violence? And what if they repeated that violence on the indigenous people and on the Black bodies of the United States in the years that followed? And so I wonder if there's a story to be dug into here that is about the displacement of common people through the enclosure of the land by the rich and powerful. that meant that people ended up in the workhouses or forced into cities, losing that connection with land to call theirs. I wonder if there's trauma in the displacement from the back-to-backs that, however slum-like they were also sources of community, into the kind of soulless skyscrapers that still populate my estate. I wonder if there's trauma and loss in the loss of factories and industry and employment, and the loss of pubs as places of gathering and community. I wonder even if there's something, and it pains me to say it, but if Margaret Thatcher had an instinct about that right to buy, that sense of having a home that you can call yours, that actually the loss of those possibilities means a kind of insecurity that ends up in waving flags and shouting. And so this is what I think we might need to challenge the powerful manipulations, to pursue economic justice for all our neighbours, to reclaim spaces of common ground, to nurture communities of deeper belonging, to seek transformative encounters and solidarities across division, and to scoot ahead, to open up spaces where those deeper pains and griefs of people, whatever journey has brought them, to call this place home, to hear together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Al Barrett. Really appreciate that. Our next speaker, Dr. Tessa Henry, I'm not seeing. I'm going to wait 10 seconds in case they may pop up. And if not, we're going to move on to our final speaker, Reverend Dr. Indigent. I'm just going to have a look. Please do drop your questions into the Q&A function. We've got some here, which is great. And so we'll move with those. And as Tessa has not popped up, I'm going to move on to our final speaker of the night, the Reverend Dr. Indigit Bogle, OBE. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alyssa. I greet you all in the name of Christ and wish upon you the peace and blessings of God. It's a real honor to be sharing the platform with the amazing prophets of God that we have heard already. I'm very grateful to all those who have arranged this event. It's clear to me that the issues around flags are complex, as we have heard. I've lived in Kenya, in India, in Britain and Ireland, and I've seen flags galore. And I can see that, yes, flags are about territory as much as anything else. I wave the Kenyan flag when I see the Kenyan runners doing well in Olympics. I wave the India flag when I see the India cricket team doing well. And I flag St. George's flag when England footballers are doing well, women and men. So the flag phenomenon in England at the moment particularly feels different to me in my experience. And it's risen particularly for me and centered on immigration matters, as we heard right at the beginning of our evening, and issues around us and them, belonging and excluding. And it's blatantly oppressive. That's how I feel it. I was listening to a Radio 5 phone-in earlier on today, and there were people who called the Union Jack a racist icon. Well, I was born in Kenya, and I lived there for 11 years before coming as a child with my family to the UK in 1964. When I was in Kenya, I heard people say Kenya for the Kenyans. In the UK, my first home, Al, was in Dudley, not far from you, in the Midlands, and not far from Smethwick, where in 1968, Powell gave his infamous speech just a few days after the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. So the issues are not new. You know, they go back to Oswald Mosley and beyond that too, right up to our current times. In and around Dudley, in areas like Cosley and Sedgley, back in the 60s and 70s, when I lived there as a teenager, there were no-go areas for people of a darker skin color like me, with mods on their scooters and parka coats and Union Jacks flying, shouting, "England for the English." I heard all that and experienced it as a young teenager. And I stood with black youths in Handsworth and in Wolverhampton in the 80s, challenging police violence and racism. But it's matters around immigration where I have focused in seeking justice from the age of 11 when I arrived in the UK and as a Methodist minister throughout my ministry. I've supported anti-deportation campaigns. I've walked from Sheffield to London to hand deliver a letter to the Prime Minister asking for a fairer deal for asylum seekers. I've visited every detention centre in Britain and Ireland to see for myself the conditions in which people who have not committed any particular crime find themselves in. In 2005, I initiated the City of Sanctuary movement, rooted in the Bible, centered on building cultures of welcome, protective hospitality, and safety for displaced people fleeing war and violence. Sheffield became UK's first city of sanctuary in 2007. There are now over 100 cities, towns, villages, areas, boroughs, places of sanctuary in Britain and Ireland. There are theatres, schools, libraries, hospitals of sanctuary. And all that says to me is that there is a strong voice challenging injustice around us. And I'm now working with churches together in Britain and Ireland to develop and promote the idea of Church of Sanctuary and Sanctuary Sunday. In my sanctuary work, I and City of Sanctuary volunteers and workers have been targets of hate, and I am from time to time asked to keep a low profile for my own safety. My biggest threat, actually, and challenge and critics, it might surprise you, are actually in churches. So we're living in challenging times with alarming levels of hostility toward people with darker shades of color of skin, and particularly towards those who are seeking sanctuary amongst us, people already traumatized by war and violence. There are elements in our society who are stoking up fears, as we've heard, adding to hatred and hostility with misinformation and mythology. And some of them are promoting this with Christian symbols like the cross of Christ standing under the cross, which for me is a desecration. And the question for me is, what is the proper response of followers of Jesus to this? What message do we speak into this hatred and hostility? And I say we challenge hostility with hospitality. In the context of rising fascism in the 1930s, Dietrich Bonhoeffer called on the church to be the church. Well, we need to heed that call now. And what that means to me is that we live out the gospel, we embody the ministry of Christ, we are called to be the body of Christ, a community of sanctuary into which we welcome and enfold and safeguard people with all our differences and diversity, radically insisting that, thank God, we're not all the same and we're not all required to be the same. The church is a house of prayer for all nations, as Israel reminded us earlier. So the challenge for me, for churches, followers of Jesus, is to stand up and to declare and to live out the gospel in these circumstances and insist that God is with us all without discrimination, for all people are made in the image of God. All people are imbued with the grace of God. All people have a capacity to know and to show love for all. And we're called to emulate Christ-likeness and model Jesus's ministry of healing, hospitality, and sanctuary for all. For Christ's love transcends all borders. And we want to affirm in this situation that Christ lived and loved and died for all. That's what the cross of Christ declares. The cross that strengthens people in their own experience of suffering and crucifixion. And then I would say we keep hope alive always, based on the story of the resurrection, refusing to give in to despair, proclaiming the fullness of life for all, and working with others to build a better world for all. And we live this out as church, as one body who share one bread, modeled in Holy Communion, where all are welcome and included, and no one is an outsider. Not only a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, but a revelation of the world that we're all called to to build. So everyone knows the story of the Good Samaritan upholding the capacity of all people to show mercy and compassion, to be human, to live with hospitality, and to refuse to live by hatred. Love your neighbor without exception. That's the rallying call and uniting call for all neighbors everywhere. In this context, in the context in which we are speaking, I bring just one uh, model, the model of sanctuary, city of sanctuary, and church of sanctuary, which I would say is a call to prophetic Christian witness and to show a way to challenge hostility and hospitality. And as Nadia called us, to really speak out, to take action, and to remember always the greatest maybe blessing of Jesus Christ, who said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness' sake, for they shall be fulfilled." So, my friend, City of Sanctuary is now regarded as the largest NGO in Britain and Ireland. And I think at the heart of it is a call for us all to work together as people of different religious faiths, as people of different political backgrounds, but to work together to build hope and to build a better world. It can be done. And I would say, here's a model that illustrates that and holds it up in front of us. So stand up and speak up for justice and righteousness. And when we do that, we will find that God is with us and will strengthen us. Bless you. Thank you all for all that you do, everybody who has spoken, but also everybody who's online, and for all that you bring into this conversation together. I feel inspired by you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Indidit Vegel. We really appreciate that. We're going to move to the questions. I want to make as much of the time as possible. So please do continue to drop them in. And as I said, please manage your expectations in terms of what we can get through in this time. I'm going to have a look through the questions here. And we might ask one question to several people. So the first question that we have is, how do you think the rise of reform has affected Christian nationalism? And I think I want to ask that to, it doesn't say who they want to send that to. So I would like to ask that to both Al Barrett and to Dr. Israel, please.
I'll jump in first as well.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
go
Yeah.
for it, Al. Yeah.
Thanks, Elisa. I think so there are people that are better placed who've been studying this stuff carefully. But my sense is that what we see happening in America has parallels, but also there are differences with where we are in the UK. And so in some ways it feels like an imported American phenomenon in its most recent form. But actually, we can trace the entanglement between Christianity and colonialism and racism way back in the history of this country too. So I think there's a historical perspective on this, that actually a church like mine, the Church of England, is only at the very beginning of owning up to its collusion with colonialism and racism throughout its history. And so there's an entanglement between church and state in this country, and church and nationalism in this country, that needs disentangling over the long term. In terms of the more recent phenomenon, I was quite delighted to see that Tommy Robinson's carol service in December actually had a very small attendance, certainly compared with his event last summer. And part of me wonders if at least his and some of those around him desire to kind of weaponize Christianity in the cause of his particular brand of a racist nationalism actually maybe isn't getting as much traction in this country as he might hope, and maybe he's looked at the States and thought there's a model to replicate. So there's both a big challenge here in this country that's a very English thing, particularly for the Church of England and churches like mine. And then there's something about the recent phenomenon that I'm not sure what's going on, but maybe it might turn out to be a damp squib. So a bit of both.
Thank
Israel.
you.
Yeah, I think reformers changed the game. Entering into that conversation because I think many were focusing on the populist movements such as Tommy Robinson and the language of Christianity within that. But to have a political party that has come in to displace, as it were, your normal traditional two political parties in terms of Labour and Conservative, and to be able to rise within a short space of time. And what people might not realize is that Reform has a Christian party as its arm. They have a Christian Fellowship for Reform, and they have a lot of heavyweights, who are philosophers and thinkers and theologians. So, in a sense, Reform has brought a bit of a credibility, if I may say, to this conversation. At least you cannot dismiss them lightly. You have to take them seriously. So they've brought some credibility, even though the idea of Christ and country. So I suppose their political theology still borders on that Christ and country, that Christendom model that I described earlier, is still there. But nevertheless, it's one that we have to engage, not by calling names, but by taking them seriously and having a robust and honest debate. So I think reform has brought something, and of course, when you look at their policies, it's all about migration and deportation and so on and so forth. And they've even talked about if they come to power, they're going to restore Britain Christians' heritage. Again, you look at this kind of language, it's reminiscent of Christendom in that sense. So they brought that to national politics. They're displaying a kind of a nationalistic Christianity at heart. And so I feel that those of us within the church and parachurch organizations, we have to take reform seriously and engage because they are a serious contender in that sense. And I would say perhaps even more insidious and dangerous in that sense.
And just following on from that, Dr. Israel, someone's asked, is nationalism incompatible with Christianity? I mean, we don't have the time for the full, but maybe
Sure,
just a
sure.
few pointers on that, just following what you've said.
I think, how do I? This is complex, even though
It's
it sounds
huge.
very straightforward, but it
Hmm.
is because I think we must all take pride in our country. So I'm a Nigerian, I'm also British. I take pride in both citizenship and country. But I suspect what might be incompatible with Christianity is toxic nationalism. I think there is a need to develop a theology of nationhood, which again we can look into scripture, both Old Testament and New, to develop that, which borders on healthy patriotism. But toxic nationalism is not compatible with Christianity. Because here's the thing. Uh, God is not a nationalist. God is not a tribalist. God is the God of the nations. That's what we see in Scripture. And so when you look at the genesis of Christianity and Old Testament theology, this idea of nations, one of the things that made Jesus furious was, the top table, when he turned the table, people were praying and doing business. I mean, people were doing business in a place where Gentiles were supposed to be praying. And Jesus actually got upset because the opportunity for people who were outsiders to connect with God, and they were doing business. So that is the Jesus we serve, right? And so God is not a nationalist, definitely not toxic nationalism in that sense. So I don't think toxic nationalism is compatible with Christianity. Christianity is inherently international, focusing because of the agenda of nations in that sense.
That's right. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to put this question to both Dr. Indiger and Bishop Mike Royal. It's the question is from an anonymous person, and it says, "What should a minister say to someone in their congregation who has said they will be joining a Tommy Robinson march?" Advice. Dr. Indiger, can you go first?
Yeah, that's okay. Earlier on today, Chair, I was listening to a phone-in conversation on Radio 5, as I said, and it was interesting to have a Reform politician who was decrying the loss of pride people feel in being British, and he particularly quoted the fact that the the young people are not taking pride in the UK as they did in the past. The number has dropped from 80% being proud to now 40%, which is a big drop. And the thing he was really asking as a response was that in terms of taking pride, all schools should have a picture of the king hanging in there, which was about as much as we got. And I thought this is rich, really, because in a way, I see in young people who are not taking pride in Britain, what they're seeing all around them is a rise in hostility and hatred. And the politics of reform have contributed to that. And it seems to me that there isn't a vision they have of uh, building a cohesive, inclusive Britain as we go forward, because in many ways, many of the people who have now become MPs within Reform are people who helped to break Britain down in the first place within the Conservative Party. So, okay, I'm going into politics a little bit here, but so I would say, okay, if you want to go that way, all right, just go with your eyes open and think carefully about what you're taking on. And from my point of view, I want to uphold always the things I was saying earlier. God is a God of all, and we need to look at how we build a Britain which has room for all, which is inclusive, where we can all take some pride in the fact that what inspires us is not hatred but hospitality. And to just finish my comment and to say also, going back to what Israel was saying, to remember that, as church, we have to uphold the gospel of Christ, and with the word of Jesus, who was saying that the house of God is a house of prayer for all nations. We have to constantly look at a vision which is inclusive of all of us, of all our national, ethnic, color, and faith backgrounds.
I would say don't miss the FA Cup on the 16th of May. No, on a serious note, I think it's important that we do engage in conversation. And, at Churches Together in England, we are just about to release some resources. And part of that resources is about helping kind of church leaders to listen deeply, but also to discern responses. But my encouragement would be to engage in discussion, to find out why they're feeling they're wanting to go. Because not everyone who goes to a Tommy Robinson march, is a far-right extremist. That there are people going for a variety of different reasons. And in fact, at the last march, I was actually in London on the day and on the street. In fact, I went through Waterloo, where they were all gathering. I refuse to be intimidated by anyone. So I just kept to what I was doing anyhow. But then, interestingly, on the train back, I was having conversations with people who had been at the Tommy Robinson march, and certainly the guy who sat next to me. He was there for all kinds of different reasons. So engaging is really important in discussion, asking questions why, and then gently, as you feel able to, just to express some of the concerns about the movement. But the most positive thing we can do is actually engage in discussion, and not to jump and be defensive, but rather to tease out what some of the motives might be.
Thank you. Thank you for the advice. And it's difficult, this is so loaded, it's so heavy. What we're hearing is such an offense to us every day. But as Christians and as people of faith, we're actually being called to use restraint as we engage. And we saw that actually with the roses and the cupcakes. So I have a question here for you. This is a question for Dr. Al Barrett. It says, how do we get to the solutions you have posed when Christianity is being hijacked to justify the division we are seeing, and politicians and political parties' entire reason is to promote division and racism? Okay, so ideas. So those who have influence over this group, they've got no idea for unity and harmony. So it sounds like, how is it even possible when the deal's already done? They have division as an end goal. What would you say to them?
It's a big question.
They all are, yeah. It's a heavy topic.
So I think I have three little responses because I'm not sure a big response is possible, and it's certainly not in my head. I think one is that those of us who are committed followers of Jesus, who reject the weaponization of Christianity, need to nurture our own discipleship and the discipleship of those around us, to build confidence, to build courage, to build an imagination to form solidarities across divisions in ways that actually are utterly true to our Christian faith and to following Jesus. So the first bit, I think, is focus on our own discipleship and the nurturing of courageous, costly discipleship in our churches. The second, I think, is something about challenging our fellow Christians, or challenging those who call themselves Christians, and our starting point is always that we take that in good faith, although judging them by their fruits, as we started this evening, is what we need to do as well. We need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves, but we need to challenge our neighbours who call themselves Christians, who are perpetuating racist agendas. That is not the gospel, and that is not the Jesus that we know. And some of those Christians have huge power and huge money. The co-owner of GB News, Sir Paul Marshall, GB News, that amplifies so much of this racist far-right agenda, is a Christian. He goes to Holy Trinity Brompton in London. And so we need to be calling out our brother and sister Christians and saying, actually, this is not okay. And then the third thing, I think, and I'm not someone that uses the language of evangelism comfortably and easily, but actually I think we need to learn new ways of evangelizing here. We need to be offering a Christianity that is attractive to those that otherwise are being drawn to the far right. And that's not to ape the far right's theology and politics by any means, but to offer a Christianity that actually can sit with anxiety and fear and those experiences of precariousness. A Christianity that is bold and courageous, and is up for standing up for the things it believes in, even though they may be quite different to the agenda from the far right. We need to become bolder in offering a Christianity that welcomes and that invites people into deep belonging, so that they can come and be themselves, but also experience transformation. So I think those are my three.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Dr. Nadia, you've come here as a Muslim woman. And there's a question here about interfaith dialogue. And actually, what I would really love to hear is why you felt and why you've come here as someone standing alone here today in your faith, but not alone here today in your hope, not alone here today in your ideas for peace, for harmony, for justice, for faith and righteous living. There's a couple of questions here. What is the role of interfaith dialogue in our current climate? Why did you think, yep, I'm coming today to this space because it's worth doing? You can only speak for yourself. And there's another question here that I want to put to you and to someone else, but I'd love to give you some time on this. There's a question that says, why is it that Black and Asian working class people do not take to the streets in the same way as their white peers? I'd love to hear your view on the question. Obviously, you cannot speak for absolutely everybody, but your own insights would be valuable, both on the question and perhaps an answer to the question as well. So first on interfaith dialogue, and then secondly on responses from our own communities on this topic.
I mean, that's a really incredibly everyone's speaking was fantastic. Reverend Al, I want to really spend time just to listen and soak up what you say, because what you've done is really inspiring for me. And just a simple act of real humanity, of cupcakes and flowers to humanize something which is not really human in terms of what people are doing is real bravery and real courage. And I really applaud you for that. And I'm really glad that people like you are there. So, sorry. I think that's really important in this time. There needs to be more humanity. In terms of why I am here, I mean, we've been working for how long now, Wally and Richard? For maybe 3-4 years together. And I think it's been a really, really effective partnership of people who share values about common good, common ground, and justice. And I think that the way that we've worked together has been fundamentally about justice. So I come to this with this focus, which is primarily not really of faith, but of justice, about the commonality that we share and that shared humanity. And that's why I'm incredibly proud of working with the Racial Justice Advocacy Forum, because we've done a lot together and really impactful work. I think that's important. I think the question was a really good one about why there's a perception that why do Black and Asian people not go as much to these rallies as others? And I think each one to their own, right? And we know there are areas when there have been throughout history, in terms of from Stephen Lawrence when he was killed, the marches went on after that, okay? Marches after the Deptford fire, but Black people coming together for that. The ones in terms of where I'm originally from Bradford, against the far right in the 70s, where people came together, right? So I think that's about perception. But now the environment is a bit different. There is a fear that going into those spaces, you could be not safe. Yeah, if you're visibly, that could be problematic for you. There's a fear of that. So I think that there are instances, there's a lot of instances where people have come together because that's the way that we have to galvanize and work. So I think that that's a perception-based one. I think that's what the media puts out as well. So I don't think that's maybe reflective of what is actually happening in terms of, it's not just about the marches. Marches is one thing. It's the advocacy. It's the politicking which underpins all of that. There are a lot more things to agitation political than marching. I've never marched, haven't, but I agitate in a way where I can get the result that I want in terms of bringing good. Did I answer both questions, or did I leave?
Yes, you have. Yes, you have. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to hear from Bishop Mark Royal, actually, on the second question, just some more, just from your perspective as well, about people taking to the streets, these responses, you've talked about what I understood or how I interpreted it as engaging with restraint. I don't know if you have experience, anecdotal experience, or we've been hearing about on the ground about people who maybe are taking to the streets or don't know how to take to the streets or have different methods to engage in this.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I was involved in the George Floyd protests in Birmingham. I led the only Christian march during the Black Lives Matter protest, kind of through London. It was the only one, and there were a number of Christians who said, "Oh, don't do this." We did it anyway. So I do have a history of marching. But what I would say is this is that for years globally, black and brown bodies have put themselves in harm's way where others sat at home. We've done our bit. Now it's your time to do yours. Secondly, in England, there is, and we need to call this out in a positive way, a real history of anti-Nazism and anti-racism that runs through the veins of the nation. And that is about white people and black people standing together. But it is also recognizing that when we are on the street, whether it's the treatment by the police or the treatment by the racists that we are facing, that as a black and brown person, you are more in danger. And so the cost is greater. And so I just get a little bit perturbed when people ask that question. I think the final thing I want to say is the issue of racism is not a black and brown problem primarily. It is a problem of whiteness and how it manifests currently in this country. And actually, the work needs to be done by white people.
Thank you. So we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to conflate a few ideas that are floating around in the chat here with a final question for absolutely everybody. There are a few questions in this chat that are basically saying, how do we overlook genuine grievances of those we are considering the nationalists, the genuine grievances of those who join the marches? We have heard in each of the talks about people's uncertainties, their insecurities, their own life experiences, their losses, whether it be from the past, traumas, their current experiences of their families. There are a few questions about how do we overlook that? But also there's a really simple question here by Joy, and it says, who should we speak up to? And I want to end this note on a kind of an action, taking into consideration that the topic is complex. It seems everybody has a grievance and everybody's fighting for priority of their grievance here. And all of our speakers have hinted at being sensitive and listening to those grievances, engaging gently with restraint. But you've also called us to speak up. You've called churches to speak up. You've called white Christians, white people to change. And so who do people speak up to? What is the action? Where are they levying their grievances for change to? If we start with...
Sorry, can I answer that question? I think this is a very, very important question. And I think what we're seeing now is that how reform and the right are coming into where they are now in terms of polling, etc., is because critical questions have never been answered properly. And I'm not bothered about the immigration one, right? These questions are about what happened in the aftermath of Margaret Thatcher's, is it the right to, from homes, he's selling off council homes, yeah? Right to buy.
Yes.
The impact of that is why housing is problematic now. These are long-standing issues which have been brought about by failed economic policies of previous administration, right? No investment in housing, no investment in education. And now, because those issues have not been addressed, right, we are where we are now, right? And immigration is then the whipping job for everything else. And that's problematic. And I think what we have is a Janus-faced state consistently. And my bigger concern is that there's a perception that conservative governments have always been really problematic around issues of race and immigration. It's not. Labour have historically been more problematic in terms of the immigration policies that they've had. And I think what this is about, it's about political leaders being honest and upfront and doing things which matters to people. How many people if you live in London, I live in London and I earn well, I can't afford to buy a house here. I can't flat. I can't. And this economic crisis has not been dealt with. These are these fundamental issues which have not been dealt with. And so racism and the encroachment of the far right has been allowed to encroach into this because these issues haven't been dealt with. But they have historical antecedents. And that's where we should speak up to.
Okay.
About the impact of those failed policies and how those have not been dealt with, but then we have little scapegoats now. And that's historically what we have had in the UK. Sorry, I'll
Thank you. We're in our final seconds. So just something brief from each. Bishop Mike Roll, could you give us?
Yes, I mean, I think we just need to recognise that right now in this moment, as costs begin to rise again, what we also have is the manipulation of markets, where you have someone who can say something on social media one day and the markets will go up, say something else the next day and they will go down, can buy while the market is down, and then say something positive and the market will rise again. And so we have the manipulation of markets, and the impact is on the kinds of communities that are out there waving flags, and also on people from global majority heritage backgrounds in this country. We really need to call out the power brokers who literally are hoarding for themselves and leaving nothing for the masses.
Thank you. Reverend Al?
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely agree with what both Nadia and Bishop Mike have just said, that the powers that be are weaponizing whiteness and racism to divide, to eclipse the economic inequalities where the 1% have immense wealth and power and the rest of us don't. And so who do we talk to? Yes, maybe we continue speaking truth to power because that's part of who we are and what being prophetic is all about. But I think these nurturing solidarities across those false dividing lines is the really crucial work that we have to do. Finding common ground in our experiences of being unhomed, as the Turkish writer Ece Temelkuran puts it. Finding common ground in being displaced, being misfits, being marginalized, being on the edges, feeling like we're losing that sense of a world that belongs to us. That's the work, I think, that we as Christians, that we as people of faith need to be doing together in this time.
Thank you very much, Reverend Indigit.
The lesson I've learned throughout ministry is that we work with everyone. Bring everyone together that you possibly can to work together to build a better world for everyone. And I mean by that all faiths, all political shades. And if we don't bring everyone together, then some people will get left behind, and that means there's an unhappiness. So get people to meet together, build relationships of mutual respect and trust, work together. And this is an endless, ongoing, never-ending work. But we have to bring everyone to share in this work together.
Thank you. And Dr. Israel, who do we speak up to in final words?
That's a good question. I think I think we need to speak to each other. We need to find common ground. We need to find ways of addressing each other. And I think today I've been reflecting a lot about St. George. So I'm going to end with him as we're talking about St. George's Day in that sense. It's quite fascinating that the patron saint of England doesn't speak English or never did spoke English. He spoke Greek, and his burial ground is actually not in the UK. So there is something there that is quite fascinating. And so in speaking to each other or in speaking up, can we have a conversation about each other, about, our various identities? I think this idea that Britishness or Englishness can be defined by monoculturalism perhaps it can be challenged by St. George's sort of roots in terms of where he came from and some of the work that he did that inspired other people in Eastern Europe and so on. It's not just only the patron saint in England, but also in other parts of Europe in that sense. And so, can we have a conversations around how multiculturalism shapes Englishness, Britishness? Can we speak to each other? In the church, can we? Because you'll be surprised that there are a lot of people in our church who have different views. And for me, that's where that discipleship element comes to, that we speaking to each other and having this difficult conversation. And I think St. George gives us actually a window to have those uncomfortable conversations with each other.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you to our speakers. We really appreciate your time. We thank you also to everybody who has signed in and your indulgence of an extra 7 minutes on a topic that could go on for hours and hours. It is complex. Together we've done our best to get through questions and to present and speak some really important truths, share some really important stories and insights, but also, as Reverend Dr. Indigit has done, bring us back to the importance, the power of the gospel that is righteousness and justice combined. We thank you so much. The webinar is being recorded and it will be available on the Churches Together in Britain and Ireland website in a few days' time. So thank you very much. Have a good night and you will hear from us soon. God bless you.